The rest of the apartment is presentable, or at least manageable. But the room, your room, is something else. Clothes in a system only you understand. A desk that hasn't been fully clear since that one weekend 2 years ago when you briefly had your life together. Books, receipts, cables, things that belong in other rooms, things that belong nowhere. You know where everything is. You will defend that point to anyone who questions it. You also know that if someone came in here right now, you would feel something. Not quite embarrassment, but something more specific, like being seen before you were ready, like someone reading your journal without asking. Because the room isn't just messy, the room is yours in a way the rest of your life isn't quite allowed to be. And the mess is part of that. People call it laziness, avoidance, a symptom of whatever they've decided is wrong with you this week. They're not seeing what's actually there, and what's actually there is one of the most psychologically interesting things about you. The mess isn't happening to you. In most cases, you're making it happen, or at least allowing it to persist, because the room is serving a function that cleanliness would disrupt. The room is the one space in most people's lives that exists completely outside the gaze of social performance. No one grades it, no one reviews it, no one arrives to it unexpectedly. And what happens to a space that exists outside social performance for a person who spends most of their life carefully managing how things look is that it becomes the one place where the management stops. The mess isn't an absence of order, it's a kind of permission to exist without optimizing. For some people, that permission is the only rest they get. You're 12 years old. Everywhere in your life, at school, at family meals, in other people's houses, there is a standard to perform against, a way things should look, a way you should present, a version of yourself that is acceptable and appropriate. Your room is the exception. Nobody grades it the same way, so it becomes something quietly important, territory that belongs to you in a way the rest of your experience doesn't. Consumer psychologist Dr. Russell Belk at York University spent decades studying what he called the extended self, the way human beings incorporate objects and spaces into their sense of identity. Belk found that our possessions are not simply things we own. They are, in a real sense, part of who we are. The way we arrange, or don't arrange, our personal space is an expression of self in a deeply psychological sense. The messy room, then, is not a neutral accident. In many cases, it's a self-expression the person isn't fully aware of making. The accumulated objects, the particular entropy of the arrangement, the specific way the desk looks, these things carry meaning. For many people, the room is the only space where their inner organization, which may be rich and highly functional, is allowed to be visible rather than hidden behind a performance of outer tidiness. Research by environmental psychologist Dr. Sally Augustin and others who study how people relate to personal space found a consistent pattern. Rooms people describe as truly theirs, private and non-performative, tend to be significantly more disordered than spaces they share with others or present to the world. The private space absorbs what the public space can't hold. The all-or-nothing trap. You think about cleaning the room, not just tidying, but actually addressing it. And in the moment you think about it, the full scope of the project arrives simultaneously. Every surface, every pile, every decision that would need to be made about every object, the entire weight of it at once. That totality makes starting any part of it feel pointless. Psychologists call this all-or-nothing thinking. And in the context of cleaning and organization, researcher Dr. Randy Frost at Smith College, whose work on perfectionism and hoarding has become foundational in the field, found a counterintuitive pattern. People who struggle most with maintaining clean spaces are often not the people who care least about cleanliness. They are frequently the people who care most. The room isn't clean because the vision of what clean should look like is so complete and so specific that doing any part of it imperfectly, which is what starting always requires, feels like failing rather than progressing. So the pile stays. Not because the person doesn't want it gone, but because the gap between the pile and the vision is so large that every attempt to cross it feels like a confrontation with that gap rather than progress across it. The mess accumulates not in spite of caring about it, sometimes precisely because of it. The paradox of the creative threshold. Messy rooms are statistically correlated with a specific kind of thinking that tidy rooms tend to suppress, and this keeps being found in research that popular opinion keeps ignoring. Dr. Kathleen Kathleen Vose at the University of Minnesota placed people in either a tidy or a messy room and gave them creative tasks. The messy room group generated more creative solutions, chose more novel options, and broke from conventional thinking more readily than the tidy room group, even when both groups reported similar levels of discomfort with the environment. The mechanism Vose proposed is that disorder acts as a weak cue against convention. It signals, subtly, that the usual rules are not fully in force. A brain that receives that signal tends to explore further beyond those rules. The room that looks like nothing is happening is often the room where the most interesting thinking occurs. The visible disorder and the invisible order of an active, exploratory mind frequently occupy the same space. This doesn't mean the mess is always productive, but for the specific cognitive mode associated with creative, nonlinear thinking, the tidy room is often the worse environment. The person who never cleans their room may be, in a specific and measurable way, protecting the conditions their thinking actually requires: permission to be unfinished. For many people, the messy room is the only place in their life where they're allowed to be in process, unfinished, existing in a state that isn't ready to be seen. Work, relationships, social media, even how the rest of the apartment looks, all require a presented version of yourself. The room is exempt from that. For someone who spends significant cognitive and emotional resources maintaining a presented self everywhere else, that exemption is not a small thing. It is rest. Dr. Brené Brown, whose research on vulnerability and shame at the University of Houston has influenced clinical psychology for 2 decades, found that one of the most consistent features of people with high shame sensitivity is exhaustion from constant self-monitoring, the energy spent ensuring that no visible aspect of yourself becomes evidence against you. The messy room, for many people, is the one space where that monitoring is off. Cleaning it, truly cleaning it, making it presentable, would turn it into a public-facing space even when no public is present. And a nervous system that finally has somewhere to exist without managing itself will resist that, even when the resistance never becomes a conscious thought. The system that only makes sense from inside. People with chronically messy rooms are frequently not disorganized in the way the mess implies. They often have an internal system, idiosyncratic and non-transferable but entirely real, that makes sense of the space. The pile on the left side of the desk is the pile of active things. The pile on the floor is temporarily displaced, waiting for somewhere to clear. The clothes on the chair are not dirty and not put away. They occupy a third category that wardrobes don't account for. The charge cables go where they go because that's where they're visible when needed. Research by organizational psychologist Dr. Eric Abrahamson at Columbia Business School on what he called a perfect mess found that personal organizational systems appearing chaotic from outside are frequently highly functional from inside, and that externally imposing order on them tends to reduce rather than improve efficiency, because imposed order disrupts the spatial memory built around the existing arrangement. You know where everything is. That wasn't a defensive claim. It was an accurate description of how your particular system works. What rarely gets named when people talk about messy rooms is the specific, recurring moment when someone enters the space and you see it through their eyes for a second. The room that felt fine becomes the room that requires explanation. The one space where you weren't performing suddenly requires you to perform. That part is genuinely hard. You grieve a little. The version of yourself who was going to be the kind of person who had a tidy room, who was going to reach the clean desk weekend and then maintain it, who had their life together enough that the space reflected it. Not because the tidy room would actually be better. In the moments that matter to you, the organized chaos works completely. But because a tidy room would mean you weren't still explaining yourself, weren't still having the same conversation about the same pile in the corner. You've been meaning to get to it for a long time. You probably will, eventually. And in the meantime, the room continues to be yours in a way that very little else is. So if someone walks into your room and sees the mess, or if you're sitting in it right now with the familiar mix of comfort and mild guilt, the room is not evidence of who you're failing to be. It's where you rest from performing who you are. If the rest of your life requires a presented version of yourself, kept together and appropriate and ready to be seen, then having one space that doesn't require that isn't a failure of discipline. It's how you stay functional. You are allowed a space that is genuinely unperformatively yours, one that reflects your actual internal organization rather than the publicly acceptable version of it, one that doesn't need to be ready to be seen because it was never built for being seen. If you want to clean it, genuinely want to for reasons that are yours rather than borrowed from someone else's standard, start with one surface, one small decision. The all or nothing thinking lies about what progress requires. 5 minutes in one corner is 5 minutes in one corner, and if you don't clean it right now, if the room stays what it is for another week or month, it's still doing something real. It's still the place where you exist without managing yourself. For many people, that's the only place they have. If this hit home, or if your room just looked slightly less like a problem, subscribe. And if you want to support this kind of work, the join button is below.